Welcome to another edition of James Martell's Coffee Talk, where James, successful publisher, speaker, and author of Online Success for Non-Techies, talks frankly and openly with experts from within the internet marketing industry about strategies and techniques you can use to develop a successful online presence for your personal or corporate brand. Here's your host, James Martell.
Hi, it's James Martell here, and welcome to another edition of Coffee Talk. My special guest today is Ed Keay-Smith from OzDomainer.com, and we're going to be talking about buying and selling domain names for profit. Ed owns his own portfolio of domain names, which he has been acquiring since 2005, and something he says he should have pursued much earlier. Ed lives with his wife Lois and his daughter Sasha, and they're also great friends of Arlene and I, and they live in Perth, Australia. Ed, welcome back to Coffee Talk.
Thanks, James. It only seems like a few minutes ago we were talking.
On that topic, we were also chatting a little bit about the power of Skype. Literally, you are a world away, or half a world away.
Yes, I'm probably, by the time I get in a plane, fly, drive a car, or whatever to get to your house, we're probably talking between 24 and 30 hours. So, look, 100 years ago, that would have been amazing.
It probably would have taken you many months if you made it at all.
Yeah, exactly true, and probably would have ended up getting there with scurvy.
Domaining now, or domainers is the term I think it is. This new development, I guess it's not new. People have been doing it since the beginning of the internet. Those who had the foresight early on to scoop up the domain names, many of the great ones, have done extremely well. But there is a business of buying and selling domain names for profit, one that you've been involved with for 7 years now. I know you've done very well with it. Let's talk about that. Let's start at the beginning, though. What is a domainer?
Domainer is someone who actually speculates on buying domain names that they intend to sell at a later date. That could be 10 minutes from now, or it could be 10 years from now, for a profit. To give the analogy of that, in the real world, it's no different to someone buying a vacant piece of land somewhere and intending to sell that land later on for a profit. So you've got to look at domain names as virtual real estate for the internet. So that is what a domainer is, someone who buys and sells domains. Domaining is the process of doing that. That is what someone does as part of their business strategy or investment strategy, is to buy and sell domains. That's domaining.
I know I've seen a lot of my friends, one in particular, and he will remain nameless for this edition of Coffee Talk at least. Maybe I'll get him on in the future. With you, we'll talk about the do's. With him, we'll talk about the don'ts in more detail. But his don'ts, and you kind of touched upon it a little bit in the last session where we talked about domain names, about seeing domain names that people have purchased earlier and then let expire. You said you could see them, that they were just a waste of money and there was really no future for them there anyway, and I paraphrase, of course. And in this particular case, he has a tendency to do the same thing. I know he saw Guy Kawasaki talking on this area of domain names and how Guy Kawasaki launched a new social network, and he bought up every permeation of that possible domain name into the hundreds of domain names that any particular way you could see it. And I could see from somebody that was a major brand, a large business doing that, but in his particular case, not really so necessary. And that's not at all what you're talking about.
No, definitely not. We're talking about buying keyword-rich generic domain names. For most people who are domainers, that's what they're doing. It's also buying things, it could be number domains like 127.com or any combination. A lot of those domains, of course, there's only a limited number of the possible combinations you can get of those, and also acronyms like abc.com or whatever it is. A lot of those are gone and probably you'll never be able to get because they're owned by companies that are using them. One of the things to look at when you're registering domain names is there are domain names that do not exist today that will exist tomorrow, a year from now. Terminologies. We're doing a podcast, for example. Now, less than 10 years ago, that term didn't exist. The iPod hadn't come out, and that's where the podcast extrapolates from. Apps was a term that wasn't used a lot, but is now a massive term. Social media. I could go on and on. There's literally dozens of terminology, keyword phrases that exist now that didn't exist 5 years ago. So there's always new opportunities, and that's where there is some degree of speculation, is looking at domains that you think may be popular, you think may have some legs for development at some stage down the track. But like anything, if you're looking at it all from the sense of a commercial point and looking at a domain name. Is that a domain that people are using as a terminology in everyday language? Is it a domain that people are searching on? So using the Google keyword tool that we've mentioned before to see if that is a term that people are searching on. If you put in a term and use the exact match setting in the keyword tool and find there's no one searching on that term, or there's 5 people, then you're either at the very, very beginning of something that hasn't taken off yet, or it's just not a term that people are using.
So would you say, is there still a business? Of course, in the early days, I remember back in the late 90s, my accountant, I found him through a newspaper ad. He used to run ads in the paper looking for clients. His method of gathering in clients was he would do $97 incorporations, and then he would take care of the bookkeeping and the accounting for that company and did really well with it. I remember his name was Andre Choquette, and he ended up buying business.com, and he bought that very early. And I remember a big newspaper article about him in 2001 or something. He'd sold it for, at the time, which was astronomical, some $3.2 or $3.4 million. Basically retired him forever, and I haven't seen him or heard from him since. Is there still opportunities? Can we still get domain names that we can buy and sell?
There's always opportunities for buying domains at a certain price today, assuming things still go the way they have been going, that they'll still be an increasing asset class and be worth more in a year or two than they are now. For example, someone who purchased a domain 2 years ago, they may have paid $20,000 for that domain to buy it. That may be worth $200,000 now. But what it comes down to is there is no one that can ever tell you what a domain is worth. No one knows that, because ultimately a domain is worth, the price that's established is what someone's prepared to pay for it and what someone's prepared to sell it for. And when those two parties meet, whatever that price is, that's what it's worth. Because you could say to yourself, oh, I've got a domain and I think it's worth $50,000. If you've got nothing to base that on and you're just plucking a number out of the air, if no one's prepared to pay $50,000 for it, then it's not necessarily worth $50,000. If the maximum you could ever sell it for is $1,000, well, that's technically what it's worth as a sale. The way to establish some sort of record is a website called dnjournal.com, run by a guy called Ron Jackson, and he keeps a very, very in-depth database of names that have sold that goes back for years. You can have a look at dnjournal.com for historical information. There's also a really great new free app for the iPhone that's been put out by a friend of mine, Simon Johnson, and it's Domain Sales app. If you go into iTunes, you can just type in Domain Sales app, and that's free to use, and that will give you a history of hundreds of thousands of domains that have been sold and what they've sold for. If you've got a domain that's related to some of those, it may give you a sort of a ballpark on where to start. That is the hardest part, is gauging a price.
So what do you look for in a domain? So when you're out there, you're always, I imagine, on the hunt. We'll talk about maybe how you go about finding them in a moment. What exactly are you looking for?
I tend to stick with things that are generic and that are commercially related. I'll give you some examples of domains that I own so you can see what I'm on about. One of the domains that we own is audiobooks.com.au. For most people who listen to podcasts, an audiobook is not that much different, except it's just an audio form of a book. Now, that's a very popular keyword term that people search on. I purchased that name a few years back. It hasn't been developed. It's parked at the moment. And parked just means where it's sitting there, it could have advertising on it, or it could just not be actually pointing to anywhere. It's just like looking at a vacant block of land. That will lead into one of the ways of monetizing a domain is parking. We'll get to in a sec. So that's an example of a domain. So I'm looking for names that are commercially related. I don't really go after names that are what I would call brandable domains. So names that are made up, like Google is an example of a domain that isn't really a term or a keyword search term, but it's something that was branded and has been built up to a multi-billion-dollar company. eBay is another one. PayPal is another one. All these names would be classified as brandable domains. They're not generic in their nature as a search term or in common language. So I tend to stick to generic, commercially related terms that people are currently searching on.
And audiobooks, of course, would be an example of that, where you've got a perfect keyword phrase there. Clearly somebody would type in audiobooks.
Yes, that particular site does get lots of people just what we call direct navigating. They just assume that there will be something at audiobooks.com.au and they type it into the web address. They bypass Google, and probably on average about 20 to 30% from the last stats I read are people direct navigating to websites. They're not searching on Google or any other search platform. They're actually just direct navigating straight to the site.
www. Type it in and land on the page.
Yeah, and most people don't even type www anymore. They just know that they can just type the domain in and it will propagate or link through to that site.
You'd mentioned to me in earlier calls that the business of domaining is absolutely gigantic. And there are a number of people on the planet that own tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of domain names. Maybe you could talk to that a little bit.
Certainly. Look, a lot of people got in very early, back in the mid-90s when the World Wide Web as we know it today got started, and had the foresight to register a lot of domains. I've interviewed in my podcast pretty much most of the major players over the last 5 years on my podcast. So if anyone wants to listen to some of those guys talk, there are words of wisdom and little pearls that you will not hear anywhere else. One of those guys I interviewed, his name is Rick Schwartz. I mean, you can actually read, he's got a very intriguing blog at ricksblog.com. Rick got into the domain industry very early and has done extremely well. He's made tens of millions of dollars. Now, another person that got in considerably later, sort of around 2001, 2002, was when this gentleman was active, Frank Schilling. Now, Frank picked up a lot of great domains when the .com bubble burst. And the .com bubble only burst because things were way overvalued than they should have been. There was lots of venture capital money going in and money was being spent left, right and centre, but they had no substance to them and there wasn't any commercial business behind a lot of the processes they were putting in place. They were just getting carried away in the euphoria of the whole .com thing. So a lot of companies, when they went bust, really the most valuable thing they actually had was their domain name, but they let those expire as well. So Frank was going along and picking up a lot of these domains. When everyone considered back then, and Rick Schwartz's blog is fascinating because he's got conversations and posts he's got going back to the sort of late 90s. The thing that's being said today that was being said 5 years ago, that was being said in 2000, that was being said in 1997, is all the good domain names are gone. Now, yes, a high percentage of the good domain names are gone, but that still doesn't mean you can't get access to them. And that was what Frank Schilling did. He thought lots of people are letting these domains expire because they don't see the value in them anymore, or they're just letting them drop because they can't pay the fees or whatever it is. He went through at a sizable risk, put pretty much a lot of his money back into what he had and spent day and night and set up systems and scripts to go through and hunt for all these domains. And he ended up, he's got a domain portfolio of about 350,000 names. He's probably the most successful domain investor on the planet, and from last time we spoke, he's making about $20 million a year from his parked domain names. None of his sites are developed.
So you mentioned the way he went about searching for them. Let's talk about, from the perspective of somebody that's considering this as a business, how does someone get started in domaining?
Okay, the first thing they need to do before they go and register anything, before they spend $1 on buying a domain name, is study the heck out of who's gone before them, what people have done that has made them successful, and then start thinking about buying domains. But ultimately, at the end of the day, there's a lot of history there. Just say the interviews I've done on my site with people who are very successful in the game, to get the degree of success that a lot of these guys have got today would be extremely, extremely difficult. You would have to spend a lot of time and probably a lot of money to get the same sort of portfolio. So let's just be clear here. People may have these big dreams of making $20 million a year from domain names. Very unlikely that's going to happen. But there is another subject we'll talk about in a sec about all the new domain extensions that have just been in the process of being released. So we'll get to that in a sec. But study the history of what people have done, what quantifies a good domain name. Because most people, they go, oh, you can make lots of money in domaining, and they'll go and register a whole batch of rubbish domain names that don't mean anything to anybody. They'll spend tens of thousands of dollars on these domains that eventually they're just going to go, oh, these are rubbish, no one wants them, and they'll just let them expire. And I see these lists of domains expiring every day, and they're useless to anybody. They're just made up words and numbers, random stuff.
So I was going to say, so there's the big word of caution. Go study the heck out of it first, and don't be registering things that have no commercial value today by understanding what you need to register in the first place.
Yes, exactly. So yeah, don't spend $1. Look at sites like DN Journal. Ron Jackson, who runs that site, has got great history of domains and what they've sold for. We're talking every possible extension like a .com or a .net or .com.au or .in for India, .co.uk for UK, etc., etc. There's lots of options of domains you can register and what extensions, what country code they're related to, many options. And the history of that is he's been running that blog for about 8 years now. He used to be a journalist, so he's got some fantastic interviews. They're all written interviews, they're not audio or video, but he does biographs on all of these different successful domain investors, and they're going back years and years and years. So there's a lot of really good information, and domain investors are very open with what they do because there's no real direct competition per se within the industry, because people are working in different areas, and once you own a particular domain name, it's not like you've got a competitor because there is only one of those domains. There's a lot of information shared.
How does someone, let's say they want to get into it, and I'm sure they would learn this by studying and listening to the various podcasts, but just for a conversation, how do you go about searching for the domain names?
So the first thing you can just do is do some research as to areas that I would say to start off with, work what's the old acres of diamonds, something you have a passion for, you're interested in, something that you know about, whatever it is. Look for keyword terms that are related to that industry. Use the Google keyword tool to see what's available or see what terms you should search for, and then go to somewhere like GoDaddy.com, which is a good place to start. Most people have heard of them. Type in the domain into GoDaddy and it will reveal the search results of what's available and what's not. Sometimes if those domains have been registered already, someone may actually want to sell them, and they have them in the what we call the aftermarket, domain aftermarket. And there's many different companies that have domain aftermarkets, but GoDaddy has its own. That's a good place to start. The other ones to go and have a look at is buydomains.com. That's a good one. Aftermarket.com is another one. Domainmarket.com is a good one, but probably my favourite one right now, which is run and owned by Frank Schilling, the gentleman that has the 350,000 plus domains. He also has a service for other people to sell their domains on, and that's domainnamesales.com. You can just do a search by domain, you can search by extension like your .com or .net. There's all different parameters you can input to reveal what they have in the aftermarket, and then they'll have buy now prices associated with the domain, or they'll be make an offer. Can I buy this name off you for X amount of dollars, and negotiating back and forth. So they're good places to start.
I remember when you and your family were up here in Vancouver and you were part of your global laptop nomad. You went from country to country.
Yeah.
I guess that's 4 years ago now. And I don't know if you remember, but when you were up here, you'd mentioned to me, and I thought this was a brilliant idea, that you were buying up all kinds of names from India. And I guess there's another place to look, is emerging economies and countries that are emerging online.
Now, that was my trade secret, James. You weren't supposed to say that. No, I'm only kidding. I talk about it all the time because, unfortunately, people in the United States tend to be a little bit insular and isolated with their view on the world. So there is no other place except for people that live in the United States. Sometimes other countries don't exist in their mind. And I'm being very broad sweeping there, so I apologise to any US listeners. So at the end of the day, there are big markets to play in that are relatively untapped and, as you say, really becoming huge. India is one of them. China's another one. But there are barriers in the sense of, okay, well, there's not that many barriers with India because India, the language that is spoken for business and for government is English. A lot of people don't realise that. They think they're speaking Hindi or some other Indian language. The majority of people in India speak English, particularly in the middle class sector. There's 350 million middle class people in India, so bigger than the population of the United States and Canada combined. They have one of the fastest growing economies. They have the biggest uptake of mobile devices on the planet. So there's a big marketplace there. And I've sold some of my most valuable domains that are India or .in. So it's an interesting marketplace.
And I'm just going to say, and it's a good reminder for all of us to think a little bit out of the box here, because we do have a tendency, me being in Canada, I look to the U.S. because it's our largest trading partner, and they're on the same continent, and we're down there visiting with our friends there, and we know America very well. It's our main television, other than our few Canadian channels. So I wouldn't have even thought about looking up domain names in India. Wouldn't have even crossed my mind. When you brought that up back then, I thought, that's a good idea.
I've got a lot of Indian domain names, and I've developed out some of them. And here's an example of how you have to look at it, and it comes back to identifying who your target market is. Again, buying a domain name, you still have to identify who the target market is, because you have to identify, if you're going to sell a domain name to someone, who's going to be the buyer. There's two ways you can sell domains. You can sell them to another domain investor or another domainer, and most of us are fairly shrewd, and we want to get the domains at the lowest possible price, of course, because we're investors. Now, selling it to an end user, so someone who's going to use that domain for development and build out and have it associated with their business, you can always get more money from those sales. So looking at it from that viewpoint, if you're going to go and register a domain in India, you need to understand what the local economy is and what they're doing, using the Google keyword search tool, of course, because you can isolate out India and just get the local search results for keyword terms for India or Australia or UK or Canada, wherever you want to isolate. So then you can go, okay, there's 5 people searching on this keyword term in India. It's probably not a good one. And there is some slight variations in the language. Like, for example, in Canada or America or Australia or UK, we would say sports equipment, okay, as a term. In India, they'll say sports equipments with an S on the end. That's not very common, but there are those slight little deviations in language that can make the difference between a lot of traffic. So an example of one that I've had for 5 or 6 years now is waterpurifiers.in, is targeted to the Indian marketplace. Now, it's all very well and good owning the .com, and if I could own waterpurifiers.com, I certainly would, but it's out of my price range at this moment in time. I don't have a water purifying business that is global, so the marketplace in India really focuses towards the .in or .co.in is their other extension. So you've really got to say, okay, if I'm going to be working in that marketplace, what are people searching on, and what's the extension, the domain extension, in this case .in, that they are using?
You've mentioned the number of searches, of course, using the Google AdWord keyword tool, exact matches, so get the words in the exact order that you're looking for the domain name in. Mm-hmm. Do you have a particular minimum number of searches that you're looking for?
Low end, I normally say 1,000. But there are some cases, again, you have to identify the target market, because if you're going to do any sort of development on a website or try and on-sell it to another end user that wants to develop that site, if there's only 50 people searching for a particular term and the product or service that they're selling is like a low-priced product, there's not really any money in it. But there may only be 100 people a month searching on something that is worth $5,000 as a sale or a service. That may still be worth going after, even though there's a lower volume of people searching. So this is where you have to do your analysis as to the marketplace.
That would be, for example, I would imagine there's not a lot of people searching the keyword phrase corporate jet. But I would imagine those people that are legitimately searching that keyword phrase are going to spend some money.
That's a good example, because that's actually just in the last 4 months has been the highest value domain sale so far that's been recorded. There are a lot of domain sales that happen that never get recorded, that have restrictions on what can be said and do not disclose stuff. But private jet sold for $30 million just recently, just the domain name. Now that's a good example. Now the average sale price of a private jet is somewhere between $10 and $50 million. So that's a big marketplace. So having that sort of domain name is worthwhile having. Even if it is a lower search volume, it's a high ticket item.
So for those that are seriously looking at this potentially as a business, they're just getting started out. You've given some tips and advice here. Of course, study the heck out of everything you can find. Of course, your domain name where you have your podcast is ozdomainer.com. I'll get you to spell it when we close up the show, but it's ozdomainer.com. And you also mentioned don't spend a dime, don't spend a penny until you've got a really good handle on what you're doing here. Is there any kind of a strategy people have budgets. You mentioned the word speculation, which means it's all speculation, it's all risk, and you don't know what the domain is going to be worth. And as you said, until the buyer and seller comes together and makes the deal, you don't really know what it's worth. How would somebody get started? What kind of investment should they have to be practical about this?
Again, the disclaimer, I'm not an investment advisor, so seek counsel with your accountant or financial advisor before you do anything. But if it was me, the way I would look at it, and I would probably come at it slightly differently now than when I did when I first got started. I'm happy to say I didn't go through the process of buying a whole stack of crap domains. I did register some that weren't that great compared to others, but everything I registered was a keyword generic term. So the first thing I would suggest is, rather than necessarily going and spending $10,000 on 200 crappy domain names, the strategy may be more in your favour to buy higher price domains, lower volume, but just better quality. So instead of buying 100 domains, buy 10 that are really better quality, higher searched on terms, better potential for development. But you have to start with what you're comfortable with. If it's the last $1,000 you've got on the planet, then I wouldn't suggest you go down this path, because you're going to have to eat. So you've really got to say, look, what do you have that you have available for investing that's disposable income? You've got to look at it as a potential risk. You're not going to lose your money in the sense of you'll still own the domain names, but you may have trouble selling them if you haven't picked up really popular names or high demand names. A lot will be revealed when you do your research and your study. A lot of things will click in place when you listen to podcasts and you get to see what others have done before you. That will reveal a lot of methodology behind what people do when they're buying domains. Grouping domains is a common practice by a lot of domain investors, where they'll focus in a particular niche area. It might be something that's finance related or credit card related or anything of that nature. They may have lots of domains based around there. They may have geographical, like it might be creditcardsperth.com. Of course, I'm making these up and they're probably already registered, but you could go credit cards Perth. So that's a geographical term that's related to a highly popular search phrase. So that could be one strategy, is just grouping products and grouping locations with those products.
Before we say goodbye here, let's talk about to those people that may have some domains. I've got a couple that I've got a few that I'm not interested in really selling, but I've got a couple that are back to the old Dash versions of the domains. I registered them probably around 1998. Mm-hmm. How would somebody go about it? One of them is desktop-publishers.com. and the other one is desktop-publisher.com. And of course, with the dashes, they're not nearly as valuable as those without the dashes, and it's the old, if I knew then what I know now, it'd be a whole different story as far as purchasing domain names. Talk to two things, if you would. Talk about the dashes. Are they still worth buying, the two-word dashes? And then also talk about how does somebody go about putting their domain names into, I guess, a marketplace?
Okay, the dashes, yes, they're not as good as the unhyphenated domains, because there's a potential barrier for people getting that name wrong, typing it into an address. If you're advertising your domain on a radio, if you're doing any sort of stuff like that, you have to say hyphen, and then a lot of people will forget that if they ever go back to their computer to type it in. So it can cause all sorts of problems. There's no negative aspects to it if you're actually putting a site on that domain. You can still rank them exceptionally well. Google doesn't discriminate with the hyphens from anything that I've read or experienced. That could all change down the track, but at this moment in time, having a hyphenated domain and ranking for that domain, there's lots of domains that pop up in the top 5 that are hyphenated I'm seeing these days. So they still have value. If you've got those types of domains, there are certainly ways you can sell them, but I personally, if you're getting started, would not go out of your way to register them. If you come across one that's a really highly searched on phrase, like desktop publisher is a very highly searched on phrase. I'm sure, I haven't looked into it, but I'm sure it's probably in the thousands on the Google keyword term.
Yeah, so I actually pulled them both up. Desktop publishers at global searches. Mm-hmm. What would you look at? You look at US market or do you look at global?
Well, for .com, I'd look at global.
Okay, so global monthly searches for desktop publisher is 60,000.
Yep.
And for desktop publishers is 6,600.
Okay.
What's the difference there?
Yeah, sometimes the plural on the domain can make a big difference in the search volume and value, so you've got to analyse that sort of stuff as well. They are worth some money. I would hazard at a guess, and again, this is just one man's opinion, I would say for the first one, you're probably looking at high four figures maybe. You might be able to get for it. Again, going to do some legwork to sell it. It could be 1,000, a couple of thousand for the other one. Ultimately, you're going to have to put it in an aftermarket. Now, the aftermarket is where you can list domains for sale. There's buy domains is one. Afternic, that's AFTERNIC.com. Afternic. There's the GoDaddy aftermarket. That's a really popular place because half of the domains that are registered on the planet these days are all going through GoDaddy, so that's a huge marketplace. So you can go to those particular places and list your domain for sale. Quite often there's no listing fee. It's only if you do sell the name, there will be a percentage that they'll take off the sale, and it's usually 10% or something of the deal, which is I'm happy with, because they've got the exposure and the visitors coming through to their sites. I think you would probably get quite a lot of attention for those domains because they're popular search terms. And my advice would be, if you want to make a quick sale, think of a price that you're really keen just to get it out the door and you just want to get some money. Think of a price and put it up for an asking price or a buy now price. But if you're not really concerned and you want to see where it goes, don't put a price on it and list it as make an offer. You might think in your head, geez, if I could get $2,000 for that domain, I'd be really happy. Whereas someone else might see it who's a buyer and go, far out, that's great, I'd offer at least $5,000 for that name. In some ways, if you put a price on it, you could be limiting the upside to what you could get for that domain. So if you're not in a hurry, you're not desperate, I would suggest leave it at make an offer. Now, one thing you'll be dealing with is that we're getting lots of silly people who don't really understand domain values, and they'll say, I'll give you $50 for that.
Thanks for offering.
Yeah,
no.
That's it. So you will get some degree of that happening if you have it set to make an offer. The other thing to do is, if you're really smart about selling the domain, if you're not doing anything with it, build a page out on, like a landing page on that domain. So when someone types it in, and they go through to that site, they'll say, look, this domain is for sale. And look, a lot of the parking companies, if you list your name with GoDaddy and places like that, they'll put a holding page on it, and this will automatically do it and take them through to the sales page anyway. If you just wanted to do it privately, you could have a landing page set up just with this domain is for sale. If you're interested, contact us through this web address, and then have a contact form. And then just take inquiries privately and deal with them that way. There are services you can use. A lot of people, when they're selling domains, have a bit of a concern that if you're selling a domain for $5,000, there's two sides of the coin that are concerned. A, you transfer the domain ownership over to someone and then they don't pay the money. Or the other side, they transfer the money and you don't transfer the domain. So to delete that type of risk or minimise 99% of it, there's a fantastic service called escrow.com, ESCROW, escrow.com. And they are the handlers of both sides, so they'll deal with the transfer for the buyer and they'll deal with the money side for the seller. And until everything's done properly and the money's in the account and the name's transferred, then they release them to both parties, so everyone's protected by a third party. So it's very cool, and I use them regularly.
Last question before we wrap up here. You'd mentioned a few times, and you're kind of leading into this now, is parking the pages and monetizing the pages. You talk about type-in traffic, and of course these pages can have the potential to rank. So how would somebody go about monetizing the domain names that they want to hold on to? They're basically part of their portfolio, but they want to possibly make some revenue from them as well.
Well, using services like domainnamesales.com, you can go there. They'll actually let you park. You have to apply. You've got to show them what your domains are. There are other services like Sedo, S-E-D-O. That's one of the popular ones. There's another one called Voodoo, VOODOO.com. InternetTraffic.com is another. These companies all provide parking services where you can change your DNS, so the domain name server, point where your domain name is listed and where it's pointing to, what computer it's going to be served on, and you point it to these companies whichever you choose. So when someone types in that name, they go through and it's all handled by them, and they'll propagate the page that people see for that domain name with advertising and sponsors and links, etc. A bit like Google AdSense in a way. So if someone clicks on any of the advertising that's on those sites, you'll get a percentage revenue share in that money. But they also will have something on there saying that domain is for sale if you choose to sell the domain. So it kills two birds with one stone, enables you to list it for sale on a proper platform, and it also gives you some potential to make money. Now, the parking revenues are very low these days compared to what they used to be 6-7 years ago. So unless you've got an extremely highly trafficked domain, and I'm saying highly trafficked as in direct navigation, so people are typing in cars.com every day of the week, or another domain that's a highly searched on name, or typed in name I should say, you will not get a lot of money from parking revenue. You might get $5 a month or 50 cents a month, depending, or $50 a month. It really depends on what the domain is. So I wouldn't suggest to people, unless they've had domains, if there's people listening that have had domains that are keyword-rich, generic names they've had for years and years and years, then that could be a different story. But if you're just going out and getting stuff now, very unlikely parking is going to pay any real significant money to you. You really have to develop the name to see the full potential. Here's an analogy someone used once that I interviewed, and I thought it was a really good one, a great way to look at it. Look at a domain name like a piece of vacant land in the middle of Times Square in New York. Now, there are two ways you can treat that vacant piece of land that is obviously valuable. You could have someone that has a hot dog stand on that piece of land. They're making some money, they're making some revenue, but it's nowhere near as much as someone that puts a 50-story skyscraper on the very same block of land. And that's how you have to look at domain development. There are all different ways you can build out a domain and make money from it. But parking is the very, very, very basic version. I would classify parking as the hot dog stand.
Any final thoughts?
Final thoughts is something that bugs me a lot, and I do understand why people get this confused, is the difference between a domain investor and a cyber squatter. We often get labelled or tarred with the same brush. A cyber squatter is someone who goes and registers domain names that are based around someone's name or business name or trademark, and then tries to profit from selling that name back to that company when they never had the right to own it in the first place. That is what cyber squatters are. They often get confused with domain owners. That would be like saying someone owned a block of land, doesn't have the right to own that block of land even though they had the foresight to buy it 10 years before everyone else did. So a domainer is someone who had the foresight to register that domain or buy that block of land. And as long as it's generic and is a keyword term that anyone has the right to, then they are a domain investor or a domainer. They are not cyber squatters.
Ed, for listeners who want to learn more about becoming a domainer, how do they get in touch with you, and where can they find your podcast?
They can listen to the podcast at OzDomainer, OzDomainer.com. They can subscribe to it on iTunes. Just type in domain names or domain names podcast into iTunes and you can pick it up there. Any questions, feel free to email me, ed@OzDomainer.com.
Ed, thanks so much.
You're welcome, James. Thanks for talking. Speak soon.
To learn more about James Martell, the School of Internet Marketing, and how you or someone on your staff can quickly and easily learn how to develop a successful online presence for your personal or corporate brand, visit theschoolofinternetmarketing.com. That's www.theschoolofinternetmarketing.com.